let's just give some background. So
Okay.
Justin Trudeau, as for people who may be outside the country listening, don't know, Justin Trudeau is the son of the former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who was considered one of the great prime ministers of Canada. He first ran for politics in the mid 2000s, and then he got elected leader of the Liberal Party in 2013, if I remember correctly. And he won his first election with a majority government in 2015. And then he won again in 2019 with a minority government. And then 2 years later, he pulled the trigger during COVID to try and get a majority, but he got a minority again. And after almost 10 years, the public got tired of him. The polls got really bad. And there was a movement even within the Liberal Party to see him resign. And finally, he decided his time was up. And he announced that he would resign in early January. And we will soon see a transition of the prime ministership from Justin Trudeau to the newly elected Liberal leader, Mark Carney. So
Okay. Thanks.
with that, I will begin in terms of some of the good things that Justin Trudeau did during his prime ministership. And the first one that comes to mind is when he let 50,000 Syrian refugees into the country. If people will recall, more than a decade ago, there was a massive refugee crisis with millions of Syrian refugees fleeing the civil war. And I think the thing that really turned it around, even though it had been going on for years, but the thing that turned it around was a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph of a toddler named Alan Kurdi, who had relatives here in Canada, and his body floating on the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. And it's a photograph that was seen around the world. And that suddenly galvanized Canadians, and Justin Trudeau took advantage of that. And I think that will be one of the positive things of his legacy.
Okay, thanks. For my first one, I think the best thing he did was initiate the dental care plan for youth, eligible youth, seniors, and persons with disabilities in Canada. I mean, I think a fully supported national health service in Canada should cover drugs, dental, eye care, and plus the existing health coverage that we have now. And I think this is a huge step, a big step in the right direction, and it will mean lots of those people that are in the lower income bracket will now have dental care. And I think the plan is to extend that, I mean, to all low income families in the future, not just youth and elderly.
But we have to remember that that dental plan wasn't a Liberal idea. It was an idea of the NDP. And it was only because the Liberals
100%.
were in a minority situation that plan came into force. And if you think
Yeah.
about some of the programs that Canadians really value, and the number one being public health care, these are not programs that originated with the Liberals. These are actually programs that originated with the NDP,
Yeah.
were put in place because the Liberals were in an NDP or they were in a minority situation with NDP support, and the NDP would not have supported them had they not put these programs in place. So a huge asterisk on that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. But if I applauded the NDP every time their thought came up, I would be doing that almost every point. But let's go ahead with your next one there, Freed.
Well, I think the another one I think that's notable, and I think has also changed the way that prime ministers will act in terms of how they appoint their cabinet, is having a gender equal cabinet. So 50% men and 50% women. And I think any future prime minister who does not have gender equality in their cabinet will be severely criticized. And think about it. You know, it's half the population, even though it may not be half the House of Commons.
Well, that's
Women
the
are,
big issue, though. Like, if you're going to do a 50% when only like 30% of the elected officials, or maybe 25 or something, are women, isn't that not a merit-based system? You're actually appointing someone just because they're a woman. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not against it. I think it's a great idea, but at the same time, it's not merit-based. So, what do you think about that?
I don't think that's the case, because you would not put incompetent people in your cabinet. Now, a lot of people who run, they have impressive credentials. You know, they're not
I don't say they're incompetent. I'm saying though that they're maybe less competent than their component because they're basically getting elected. So there's no test here for competency or reading and writing or whatever. You're basically convincing the public that you deserve that position. And I think some of them are extremely competent. In fact, most of them are. But I think some politicians are certainly a lot less competent and a lot less experienced. And so, I mean, you are going a little bit against the merit principle when you're doing that.
Yeah, but if you look at the last 10 years of the Trudeau government, who are the people, who are the cabinet ministers who got into the most trouble? It wasn't the women, it was the men.
That's an excellent point.
You know,
Uh,
so one could say that maybe there should be more women in the cabinet than men, given that record.
Yeah, that's true. I saw
So,
a podcast the other day talking about Iceland, and this lady was saying that it's like their whole government, like all their senior leaders, the government, the leader, this mayor, this whatever, they're all women. So it's just this free case probably of anywhere in the world where all a huge amount of their major leaders are women, and I'm not against that at all. I think women can and do a great job.
yeah, and
So
I think with regard to gender equality, there are some. I'm not sure if this is the case or not, but I know that there's efforts in certainly the Nordic and Scandinavian countries to uplift more women into public office so that there is gender equality. And it's interesting that if you look at countries that have had women leaders, the first women leaders didn't weren't in the West. They were actually in developing countries. The one that comes to mind is Indira Gandhi in
Indira Gandhi,
India,
yeah,
Pakistan, Benazir
yeah.
Bhutto, the leader of Bangladesh. It's interesting. The South Asian countries have all had women leaders, as have
Are you
a
gonna
number
pick
of.
the leader of, Myanmar there too? Just,
Oh yeah,
look
well,
at us.
yeah, we'll get to that. So now, what's your next highlight of the Trudeau era?
So, while I don't think he addressed, wealthy and he doesn't really have a wealth tax, I think a capital gains tax, like the increased capital gains tax above 250,000 for capital gains was a move in the right direction. I think that was a good move by the party. Once again, it was probably due to influence of the NDP to a certain degree. But I'm very disappointed to read that, Carney, the new Liberal leader, plans to remove that tax, and it never did get passed. And even though caused lots of confusion apparently, and it never did get passed. So I'm a little bit irritated that that's probably not going to go through. I think it would have moved us in the right direction. Although people think that taxes are bad, and if you're someone that happens to sell a second property and you're going to have to pay more tax as a result of it, and some of those are average people, but then again, it's you're not in the lower, let's say 30% if you have a second property that you're selling and you're gonna make
Or
capital
even
gains
lower
on it.
50%,
Or
like
even
even.
lower 50, yeah, like, I've read numbers though that 40% of Canadians own a second property or something like that. It was a pretty big number. Um, but you're right, even lower 50%. I mean, these are generally the wealthier people in Canada. But the biggest issue is the capital gains for people that are making 10,000,000, 20,000,000, 100,000,000. Like they should be paying a lot more taxes, and that can be used to support programs across Canada, whether that's education, healthcare, etc. So not having that tax means they're going to have to cut somewhere else, and everyone's going to suffer as a result. So
Yeah, unfortunately, we've had this narrative that's been pushed by right-wing think tanks and right-wing politicians now for almost 40 years that taxes are bad and that taxes are too high. But you
yeah,
know what? You look back at the 40s or the 50s and 60s and 70s when we did have high taxes. I mean, the top marginal tax rate in Canada at the time on the wealthiest individuals was in the 90%
yeah.
range. Corporate taxes were in the 60% range.
Even in the US, it was like that
Yeah,
post-war.
exactly. And
And the
it wasn't.
economy boomed for 20, 30 years, and then they start cutting taxes, and now healthcare declines, and,
Well, I mean, infrastructure has been crumbling
yeah,
for decades now. The healthcare system is in crisis. We've got increased homelessness like we never saw. I remember the first time a food bank opened up in Canada in the 80s, and it was supposed to be a temporary thing to help the most in need. And now we've got food banks in every town and
Yeah.
city that can have them, and you've got people who are working, one and two jobs, who are forced to rely on food banks. So I think a part of that is because of this narrative that's been pushed that taxes are too high, and with lower taxes means lower government revenue for the programs that sustain us.
Yeah. No, 100%. And the fact is that's not a situation that has to exist. Like, we can actually increase taxes, we can increase minimum wage, and those problems will just go away. Like, if you address them, if a government wants to get in place that wants to address them, those problems will go away, and we can afford it. I mean, we're one of the, I don't know, wealthiest 7, 8, 10 countries in the world. We can afford it. So
Well,
what's your
all you have to do is look at countries like Finland and Norway and Sweden, which have
yeah,
much higher personal taxes as well as corporate taxes. But doesn't mean that people aren't making profits. People in business aren't making profits. Companies aren't making profits. They have their share of billionaires as well, but they also have a much higher quality of life and a much higher satisfaction as a society in who they are and what they do, and they see themselves as compassionate nations that will try to look out for those who are under stress, or underprivileged or homeless or what have you. And they seem to be doing quite well. And of course, their health systems aren't facing the sort of crises that we're facing. They don't have the level of homelessness that we do, and they're paying far more in taxes. And I think that's part of the reason that
yeah,
there's more government revenue to address those problems.
yeah. No, that's 100% true. So what's your next point there, right?
Well, I think the other thing that I think Trudeau will be remembered for, and of course, this didn't come about naturally. It did take a lot of lobbying by human rights groups for this to take place, and I was involved in some of that. Was that he recognized the Rohingya genocide that was taking place in Myanmar. It was unanimously recognized by the government in the House of Commons and the Senate, and he rescinded the honorary Canadian citizenship of Aung San Suu Kyi, who was Myanmar's de facto leader, for her complicity in that genocide. When that happened, that was heard around the world because we were the first country to recognize the Rohingya genocide, and a group that I'm still involved with. It's called the Rohingya Human Rights Network. We received all kinds of messages and emails thanking Canada, thanking us for our efforts, and thanking the Canadian government for doing that. They finally felt like they were seen and they were heard, and that was significant. And I think
That is
that,
significant. That's great to hear, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
But it's sad to hear that of course, it's not resolved and it's still ongoing, and most of those people's had to flee the country, or many of them. I don't know how many are still left in Myanmar, but
Something like over 90% of Rohingya now live in the diaspora. Over a
yeah,
million of them live in the largest refugee camp in the world in Bangladesh, which is now facing added stresses because of the U.S. government cutting off U.S. aid programs in that camp. In fact, U.S. aid provided almost 50% of the programming and support in that camp. And within Myanmar itself,
that's a huge issue right across the world, the US aid, cancellation or reduction, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And in Myanmar itself, there's still a genocide ongoing, with about 400,000 Rohingya left there who haven't been able to escape, thousands of them sitting in what are literally concentration camps. And I mean, this is a population that is less than 2% of the country. And
Yeah,
it's actually shrunk over the years because of genocidal policies of the Myanmar government. So this is not a population that it's a threat. So it's just pure racism and bigotry that has caused this, and it's a crisis that's been forgotten in the face of all the other things that have been going on.
I don't think it's forgotten for everybody, but you're right. And I mean, people go on with their daily lives and deal with their own issues, and they don't realize some of these major catastrophes that are happening across the world. One thing about the Rohingya one in Myanmar is that it's interesting that it's a Buddhist government that's doing this, which is so strange because we have this image of Buddhism as a peaceful, well thought out, but it just shows that, any group, any society can actually have some real prejudice and bias and behave very inappropriately in certain circumstances. Uh,
Well, it might be Buddhism, but the Dalai Lama has admonished the Buddhists in Myanmar for their behavior, for their racism and for the sort of narratives that they've pushed that are contrary to the teachings of Buddha. So it might be a Buddhist government, but
Yeah.
it's a Buddhist government in name only. The
Yep.
same way that you could say that there are some governments that are Christian and yet they don't abide by the teachings of Christ. So and same thing with Muslim governments. There's Muslim governments led by Muslims, and I would say that yeah, that's not what Islam teaches.
I like the quote. I think it's by Christopher Hitchens and stuff, and you probably don't care for him much, but he's got. I think it was him or another fellow that quoted that. Bad people do bad things, but only religion allows good people to do bad things.
Well, actually, I am a fan of not Christopher. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Christopher Hedges, not
Oh,
Christopher
okay.
Hitchens. Yeah,
Yeah,
so, sorry. Yeah, so yeah, Christopher Hitchens,
probably
not one
not
of
a fan,
my favorite people. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I
So
like that quote. But I do think he might have some issues or had some issues. He's passed a long time ago now.
yeah,
So my third issue is and I'm just going to cover this one quickly, is that he did a lot for moving the needle on reconciliation with Indigenous people. I think that's a real challenge. I don't think it's completely met or resolved yet. I don't think some of the approaches were done the best way. I'm concerned with all the money they're spending. They're still not addressing some of the issues that they're doing, but just the generic move in general to reconcile, to especially recognize all the damage that was done in the residential schools across Canada, and having grown up in Canada, and um, and seeing certain reserves and stuff like that, and having been totally oblivious to what's going on, um, as a young person in Canada, it's now good to see that all this is coming to light, and it's at least there's recognition of that.
yeah. But the thing is that while he has moved the needle, there are still issues. Like even during his government, they opposed the Canada Human Rights Tribunal decision with regard to funding for social welfare on reserves, which they finally had to settle. I can't recall the exact amount, but the settlement was in the tens of billions of dollars. Um, it took them how long to address the issue of fresh water on reserves, clean water on reserves. I'm not sure if all those water advisories have been eliminated. I think there might be still one or two reserves still dealing with water
I think there
advisory.
was still quite a few, yeah, there was a number of them, but I mean, I don't know where the responsibility does for that, for, like, because it's not the responsibility of, say, the federal government to provide, like, cities with water supplies. So, I mean, if you have your own governments and your own resident, is it not their own responsibility to provide for their water systems, et cetera, under their own tax system, whatever? Like, let's say, another non-indigenous community maybe has a poor water system. Does the federal government come in and supply that? Or maybe there's an obligation in the treaty to do that? I mean, where does that provisioning come from?
I think that comes from the nation-to-nation relationships between Indigenous people and the federal government. A lot of reserves are funded through federal dollars, and
Yeah.
this is part of the treaty arrangements that are in place. And these reserves don't have governments like municipal governments. They
No,
don't
they
have
don't.
they don't have the economic foundations like municipalities do to collect taxes because they're still very high levels of poverty on these reserves across the country. And so the only way that um, they're able
There is, but I mean, it's somewhat of a choice to live in that environment. It's not like, why don't they, like, I'm originally from Cape Breton, and that was an economically depressed area, and I moved here in Ottawa a number of years ago. I had no choice if I wanted to have a livelihood. So I mean, it's a little bit interesting that they choose to stay on reserves, even though it may not be economically feasible. But I mean, maybe that makes sense. I don't know what the whole big picture is. I'm not an expert on that, but
There might be a subject for a more in-depth look in
yes.
another podcast.
It's something I'd like to learn more about, because I don't really know a lot about that subject, and I actually shared a place with a Indigenous fella back when I first moved to Ottawa there over 30 years ago, and it was quite interesting talking to him to get his views on life. But of course, I wasn't talking about politics and issues about Indigenous relations then. It was just general discussions.
Well, we also have to remember that the relationship between the governments of Canada, both pre and post Confederation, are relationships of power of a colonizer over a colonized people. In addition, the way that Indigenous people were treated from the very beginning, the the governments of Canada attempted to wipe them out. There was an active policy of genocide. That's what Indigenous or Indian residential schools was about. That's what right now is still going on, where there's
I
issues
don't
of,
think that was a policy of trying to wipe them out. It was a policy of trying to suppress their culture and make them unsavage, is the term they probably would have used. I don't think there was a position to wipe them out. I mean, not to
well,
say that there wasn't other positions or other efforts. I don't think that was the purpose of the residential schools. I think that was a cultural prejudice as opposed to a wipe them out sort of thing.
well, I'd have to strongly disagree with you there
Yeah.
because, yeah, because I've done the research, I've read the history, and when you have someone like Sir John A. Macdonald saying, you know, like not only calling them savages but wanting to, there's language that's in Hansard that can be considered language that is genocidal in nature. And then, of course, after Sir Johnny MacDonald with the residential schools, Sir Wilfrid Laurier came in and he even, you know, made it even more difficult. Of course, we have the situation where Indigenous people weren't allowed to vote in Canada until the 1960s. There was an agreement that was not an agreement, but an apology that was just issued to Inuit just a few days ago by the Indigenous Affairs Minister about when Canada actually transferred Inuit people to the northernmost part of Canada and expected them to survive, and many died. There's the incident of where the Canadian government came in and killed all the sled dogs of an entire Inuit community. There's many instances of this, and of course, you know, this wasn't something that happened 100 years ago. Some of this happened within our lifetimes. You know, they're the last residential school didn't close until the 1990s, and even now, the legacy of that continues. So yeah, that's
Well, things are changing quickly now. I mean, really, in the century time frame, we're barely out of the dark ages, right? Like it wasn't that long ago. So, I mean, with communications and platforms like this, and we are dramatically changing in a very short time frame.